Before we start, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel and tells me you want more creepy mysteries from Japan. Now, let's dive into one of the darkest legends in Japanese history. Deep in the mountains of Fukuoka Prefecture, on Japan's southernmost island of Kyushu, lies a place that locals refuse to speak about after dark. The Old Inunaki Tunnel, a concrete mouth carved into the mountainside that seems to swallow light itself. Built in 1949 to connect remote villages through the treacherous mountain passes, this tunnel served faithfully for 26 years before being sealed and abandoned in 1975. But abandonment didn't bring peace to this cursed passage. Today, if you be brave enough to make the journey through winding mountain roads that seem to grow narrower with each turn, you'll find the tunnel's entrance blocked by rusted metal barriers. Warning signs and faded Japanese characters tell you to stay away. But it's not the official warnings that chill your blood. It's the graffiti. Layer upon layer of desperate messages scrawled in paint and carved into concrete. Some are prayers, others are warnings, and some are pleas for help that were never answered. The tunnel stretches 365 meters through solid rock, a number that locals say is cursed. 1 meter for each day of the year that the dead must wander. When it was active, drivers would hold their breath passing through, watching their speedometers climb as they raced to escape the oppressive darkness. Even then, before the murders and the legends, something was wrong with this place. Construction workers in 1949 reported tools going missing, strange echoes that didn't match their hammer strikes, and shadows that moved independently of their light sources. 3 workers died during construction, officially from cave-ins and equipment failures. Unofficially, the survivors whispered about something in the rock that didn't want to be disturbed. The tunnel's design itself seems wrong somehow. The slight curve midway through means you can never see both ends at once. Drivers described a moment of complete blindness in the center, or even headlights seemed swallowed by the dark. Some claimed their radios would fill with static at that exact spot, broadcasting voices speaking in dialects so old that even elderly locals couldn't understand them. By the 1960s, the stories had begun. Night shift workers at nearby factories reported seeing lights moving through the sealed tunnel long after the last car had passed. Hikers found wet footprints leading from the tunnel entrance on bone-dry days. Children playing near the mountain reported hearing their names called from within the concrete depths, spoken in voices that sounded like their own. The local police kept detailed records of these reports, initially dismissing them as hysteria. But patterns emerged that couldn't be explained. Electronic equipment malfunctioned within a 100-meter radius of the tunnel. Photographs taken near the entrance often showed strange distortions. Shadows where no objects existed to cast them. Faces in the concrete that weren't there when the picture was taken. When the new tunnel opened in 1975, authorities were quick to seal the old passage. Too quick, some said. The barriers went up overnight, without the usual public notices or environmental assessments. Workers who installed the barriers were brought in from outside the prefecture, and they completed their job in absolute silence, refusing to speak to locals or even stay overnight in the area. But sealing the tunnel didn't contain whatever lurked within. If anything, the hauntings intensified. Teenagers, drawn by the growing reputation of the place, began sneaking past the barriers. Most returned with stories of cold spots in the summer heat, of whispers in the dark that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Some described seeing a figure in the center of the tunnel, always just at the edge of their flashlight beams, always disappearing when approached directly. Others weren't so lucky. The first recorded disappearance was in 1976, barely a year after the sealing. A university student named Hiroshi Nakamura went to investigate the tunnel for a folklore project. His car was found parked at the entrance, doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition. His flashlight lay on the ground just inside the barriers, still switched on, but somehow providing no light. Hiroshi was never seen again. The police search found something that chilled even experienced officers. Footprints in the dust, Hiroshi's sneakers, based on the tread pattern, led into the tunnel and simply stopped halfway through. Not turned around, not obscured by other tracks. They just ended, as if he had vanished mid-step. More disappearances followed. Always young people, always drawn by curiosity or dares. The pattern was always the same. Cars found running, personal belongings dropped just inside the entrance, and footprints that led nowhere. The authorities installed additional barriers, posted guards, even considered filling the tunnel with concrete. But something always went wrong with these plans. Equipment would malfunction, workers would refuse to return after their first day, and the guards, well, the guards had their own stories. One security officer, speaking on condition of anonymity years later, described his single night watching the tunnel entrance. He'd positioned himself in a small hut about 50 meters from the barriers, with a clear view of the sealed entrance. Around midnight, he said, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. His radio filled with static, then suddenly cleared to broadcast what sounded like a traffic report from the 1960s, complete with references to roads that no longer existed. But it was what he saw that made him quit the next morning. A procession of figures had emerged from the sealed tunnel, walking single file through the solid metal barriers as if they weren't there. Men, women, children, all in clothing from different eras. They moved without sound, their feet never quite touching the ground. At the head of the procession was a figure in a construction worker's helmet, one side of his head caved in as if struck by falling rock. The guard said he counted 37 figures before he lost consciousness. When he awoke at dawn, there were 37 sets of wet footprints leading from the tunnel to the nearby forest, though it hadn't rained in weeks. By the early 1980s, the Old Inunaki Tunnel had gained a reputation throughout Japan. Paranormal investigators came from Tokyo and Osaka, drawn by stories that seemed to grow more terrifying with each telling. Most left quickly, their equipment drained of power, their recordings filled with sounds that hurt to hear. A few never left at all. The tunnel seemed to feed on attention, growing stronger with each visit. Locals reported that the whispers could now be heard even during the day, carried on winds that blew from the mountain regardless of weather patterns. Trees near the entrance withered despite rich soil and adequate rainfall. Animals avoided the area entirely. A forest that should have teemed with life fell silent in a radius that grew larger each year. But the tunnel's appetite wasn't satisfied with mere supernatural terror. It hungered for something more substantial, more real. It waited with the patience of stone and shadow for someone to feed its growing darkness. In 1988, that hunger would be satisfied in the most brutal way imaginable. The legend of Old Inunaki Tunnel was about to become a nightmare written in blood and flames. The morning of December 8, 1988, dawned cold and gray over Miyawaka City. Most residents were beginning their daily routines, unaware that before the sun set, their quiet mountain community would become synonymous with one of Japan's most horrific crimes. Kenji Yamamoto was 23 years old, working at a local electronics factory and engaged to be married in the spring. He was driving home from his late shift when his car broke down on the mountain road near Old Inunaki Tunnel. It should have been a minor inconvenience, a dead battery, a cell phone call to a friend, and a jump start that would have him home within an hour. Instead, it became his death sentence. The details of what happened next come from police reports that took investigators months to piece together witness testimony that still haunts those who heard it, and physical evidence so disturbing that several officers requested transfers rather than continue working the case. At approximately 11:30 p.m., 3 men in a stolen vehicle spotted Kenji's disabled car. They were already wanted for a string of robberies across Kyushu, but what they did that night went far beyond theft. They were Hiroaki Seiki, 21. Masashi Kitamura, 19. And Takeshi Watanabe. 20 names that would become synonymous with evil in the annals of Japanese crime. According to later confessions, they initially approached Kenji under the pretense of offering help. When he gratefully accepted, they forced him into their car at knife point. But instead of driving to a secluded area for a simple robbery, they made a decision that would damn them all. They headed for Old Inunaki Tunnel. Why they chose the tunnel remains a mystery that psychiatrists and criminologists still debate. Seki, the ringleader, later claimed he heard stories about the place and thought the isolation would give them time to extract information about Kenji's bank accounts. But survivors from their later confessions suggest something darker. A fascination with the tunnel's reputation, a desire to add their own mark to its already bloody history. They parked near the tunnel entrance and dragged Kenji past the barriers that were supposed to keep people safe. Inside the concrete darkness, they began their assault. What started as a robbery quickly escalated into something far more sinister. The acoustics of the tunnel meant that Kenji's screams echoed and amplified, creating a symphony of terror that seemed to please his attackers. For 6 hours, they tortured him. The medical examiner's report, sealed for decades due to its disturbing nature, documented injuries that suggested the attackers had taken their time, exploring the limits of human endurance. Cigarette burns, knife wounds that avoided vital organs to prolong suffering, and blunt force trauma that was carefully applied to cause maximum pain without immediate death. But the torture was only the beginning of their depravity. At some point during those endless dark hours, they decided that Kenji had seen too much, knew too much, to be allowed to live. But a simple killing wasn't enough for men who had already crossed every line of human decency. They wanted to ensure he could never be identified, never be traced back to them, never testify to their crimes. They doused him with gasoline they'd brought for their stolen car and set him ablaze. Kenji Yamamoto burned alive in the heart of Old Inunaki Tunnel, his final screams joining the chorus of voices that locals claimed already haunted that cursed place. The concrete walls absorbed his agony, adding it to the supernatural miasma that had plagued the tunnel since its construction. The killers fled, believing they had committed the perfect crime in the perfect location. They had chosen a place already steeped in supernatural dread, where local police rarely ventured, where any screams would be attributed to ghosts rather than investigated as crimes. They thought the tunnel's reputation would protect them. They were wrong. The fire damaged the tunnel's structure, and smoke was visible from the main road the next morning. When fire investigators arrived, they found a scene that veteran officers would later describe as the worst they'd ever encountered. The victims' remains were so badly burned that identification took weeks. The concrete walls bore scorch marks that seemed to form faces in the patterns, an effect that investigators attributed to pareidolia, the tendency to see familiar shapes in random patterns, but which local workers refused to dismiss so easily. Evidence collection was hampered by what investigators described as environmental anomalies. Electronic equipment malfunctioned repeatedly. Photographs came out distorted or completely black despite proper lighting. Several investigators reported feeling watched, hearing whispers in the empty tunnel, and experiencing sudden temperature drops that made their breath visible even on warm days. The breakthrough came when one of the killers, Takeshi Watanabe, began experiencing what his cellmates described as a complete psychological breakdown. Within days of the murder, he was screaming in his sleep, claiming that Kenji was visiting him nightly, appearing at the foot of his bed with his flesh still burning. The hallucinations were so vivid and consistent that other inmates requested transfers to different cells. During interrogation, Watanabe confessed to everything, providing details that only someone present at the crime could have known. His confession led police to Seki and Kitamura, who initially denied involvement until faced with physical evidence linking them to the scene. But even after the confessions, the case remained troubling for reasons that went beyond the crime itself. All three killers reported identical nightmares. Kenji Yamamoto standing in flames, reaching out to them with charred hands, speaking words they couldn't understand, but somehow knew were curses. Seiki, the ringleader, developed a stutter he'd never had before, and an involuntary tic that made him constantly look over his shoulder. Kitamura stopped eating, claiming that all food tasted like smoke and burned flesh. The psychological evaluations painted a picture of three men who had crossed a line that led not just to legal punishment, but to a kind of spiritual damnation. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the psychiatrist who evaluated them, noted in her sealed report that their symptoms were unlike any trauma response she'd encountered. They weren't experiencing guilt or remorse in any clinical sense. They were experiencing what she could only describe as haunting. During the trial, several disturbing incidents occurred that the media was asked not to report. Court clerks spoke of documents related to the case becoming illegible overnight, as if the ink had run despite being stored in climate-controlled conditions. Security cameras in the courthouse malfunctioned only during proceedings related to the Inunaki Tunnel case. Most unsettling, witnesses and court officials reported hearing screaming echoing through the building's ventilation system, screaming that seemed to come from the courthouse basement, which had no ventilation ducts. The trial concluded with all three men receiving life sentences. Justice was served, but everyone involved in the case felt that something larger remained unresolved. The murder had awakened something in Old Inunaki Tunnel, fed it with pain and terror of the most extreme kind. In the months following the sentencing, reports of supernatural activity around the tunnel increased dramatically. The whispers that had once been subtle became screams audible from the main road. The figure glimpsed by previous visitors was now seen regularly, a burning man who walked the tunnel's length, leaving footprints of ash that disappeared by morning. Local police began receiving calls about lights moving through the sealed tunnel, not the vague lights of previous decades, but the clear orange glow of flames that never consumed their fuel. Hikers reported the smell of burning flesh carried on mountain winds, so strong it made them vomit. Some claimed to hear two voices echoing from within, the tortured screams of Kenji Yamamoto and the desperate pleas of his killers, begging for forgiveness that would never come. The 1988 murder had transformed Old Inunaki Tunnel from a place of vague supernatural dread into something far more sinister, a location where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the damned had been permanently shattered. The brutality committed within those concrete walls had created a spiritual wound that seemed to grow larger with each passing year. But the tunnel's hunger was not yet satisfied. The murder had awakened something ancient and evil, something that predated the concrete and steel, something that had been waiting in the mountain's heart for centuries. The legend of Inunaki Village was about to emerge from the shadows of folklore into terrifying reality. The worst was yet to come. In the forests beyond Old Inunaki Tunnel, hidden among mountain paths that appear on no modern maps, local legend speaks of a place that shouldn't exist. A village where time moves differently, where the laws of Japan hold no power, and where visitors check out but never leave. The residents call it Inunaki Village, the Howling Dog Village, and according to those brave enough to speak of it, it's still there, waiting in the shadows beyond the tunnel's cursed mouth. The stories of Inunaki Village predate the tunnel by centuries, woven into the oral traditions of mountain communities that have long since been absorbed into modern cities. But unlike most folklore that fades with time and urbanization, the tales of Inunaki Village have only grown stronger, more detailed, and more terrifying, especially after 1988. According to the oldest stories, the village was established sometime in the early Edo period by a group of outcasts, criminals, political dissidents, and those fleeing religious persecution. They carved out a settlement deep in the mountain forests, far from the shogun's reach, far from the eyes of authorities who might judge their past crimes or current practices. Over generations of isolation, The villagers developed their own laws, their own customs, and their own interpretation of justice. The village's name comes from the packs of wild dogs that supposedly guard its borders. Animals that howl warnings to residents when outsiders approach, and hunt down those who try to leave without permission. But older residents of Miyawaka City whisper that the howling isn't from dogs at all, but from the voices of visitors who tried to escape and failed, their cries joining the eternal chorus that echoes through the mountain valleys. The most persistent legend centers around a weathered wooden sign allegedly posted at the village entrance. Hand-carved in characters that mix archaic Japanese with symbols that linguists can't identify. It supposedly reads, "The laws and constitution of Japan do not apply here. Enter at your own risk." Below this warning, according to those who claim to have seen it, are stacked the personal belongings of those who ignored the message. Wallets, watches, cell phones, and car keys arranged in neat piles that grow larger each year. Modern versions of the legend describe Inunaki Village as existing in a pocket of twisted reality, where the residents appear normal at first glance, but reveal disturbing abnormalities upon closer inspection. Some are said to be impossibly old, claiming to remember events from centuries past. Others bear injuries that should have been fatal, burns that never heal, wounds that never close, missing limbs replaced with crude prosthetics made from wood and bone. The village economy, according to these accounts, is based entirely on what its residents take from visitors. They strip newcomers of everything: possessions, memories, and eventually, identity itself. Those who try to resist are supposedly subjected to punishments that make death seem merciful. Those who comply are gradually integrated into the village population, their outside memories fading until they can no longer remember life before the mountain. But the most disturbing aspect of the Inunaki Village legend isn't the isolation or even the violence. It's the suggestion that the residents are actively recruiting new members. Since the 1988 murder in the tunnel, reports have increased of village representatives venturing out at night, approaching travelers on remote mountain roads, offering assistance to those whose cars have broken down or who have become lost on hiking trails. These recruiters are described as polite, helpful, and completely normal in appearance. They offer rides to stranded motorists, directions to lost hikers, and invitations to rest in their village until morning. But once someone accepts their help, once they enter the village borders, they discover that hospitality comes with a price that can never be fully paid. Kazuki Matsuda, a truck driver who claims to have encountered these recruiters in 1995, described his experience to local police. He had pulled over on a mountain road to rest when a middle-aged woman approached his cab. She was well-dressed, spoke politely, and explained that her car had broken down near the old tunnel. She asked if he could drive her to her village, just a few kilometers up a forest path he'd never noticed before. Something in her manner made him suspicious. She was too calm for someone stranded at night, too well-groomed for someone who'd been walking through the forest. When he declined to help, she smiled and walked back toward the tree line. As she moved away from his headlights, Matsuda swears he saw her reflection in his side mirror continue for several seconds after she disappeared into the darkness, as if her image was burned into the glass itself. More disturbing are the accounts of those who claim to have actually visited the village and somehow escaped to tell about it. These testimonies, while impossible to verify, share common elements that suggest either a shared delusion or glimpses of a terrifying reality. Survivors describe being led down forest paths that seem to shift and change, making it impossible to retrace their steps. The village itself is supposedly a mixture of architectural styles from different eras. Traditional thatched roof houses next to concrete structures from the 1960s, all showing signs of repair, using materials and techniques that don't match their original construction. The residents, according to these accounts, are friendly but wrong in subtle ways that become more apparent over time. Their conversations reference events that haven't happened yet, or remember things differently than recorded history. They eat meals consisting of foods that don't spoil, despite having no visible means of preservation. Children play games that involve practices that would be considered disturbing anywhere else. Mock executions, ritualistic scarification, and competitions to see who can remain silent the longest while experiencing various forms of pain. Most unsettling are the reports of a village leader known only as the mayor, an ancient figure who supposedly oversees the integration of new residents. Survivors describe him as having burns covering most of his body, injuries that are clearly decades old, but seem to still cause him constant pain. He speaks in a mixture of archaic Japanese and unknown languages, and his presence reportedly causes electronic devices to malfunction and temperature to drop dramatically. The mayor's primary role, according to these accounts, is determining which visitors will be allowed to leave and which will join the village permanently. His decisions seem arbitrary to outsiders, but residents understand the criteria perfectly. Those who show proper respect for the village's traditions, who demonstrate understanding of its unique nature, may be permitted to depart after surrendering something significant. A cherished memory, a decade of their lifespan, or the ability to speak of what they've seen. Those who resist, who demand to leave immediately, or who threaten to contact authorities, face what residents call the integration process. This involves a series of rituals designed to break down the person's connection to the outside world. First, their possessions are ceremonially burned. Then, their memories are systematically altered through techniques that survivors describe as both psychological and supernatural. Finally, their identity is reconstructed to fit village norms, leaving them as functioning residents who no longer remember life beyond the mountain. But the most terrifying aspect of the Inunaki Village legend is its connection to Old Inunaki Tunnel. According to local folklore, the tunnel serves as more than just a route through the mountain. It is a doorway between the normal world and the village's as twisted reality. The 1988 murder supposedly strengthened this connection, making it easier for village residents to cross between realms and more difficult for outsiders to resist their influence. In the years since the killing, hikers and urban explorers have reported finding evidence of village activity near the tunnel. Fresh footprints in areas where no one should be walking. Campfires that burn without fuel and produce smoke that smells like incense mixed with charred flesh. Most disturbing, recordings of conversations in languages that sound familiar but can't be understood, as if the words are almost Japanese, but not quite. Some investigators theorize that Inunaki Village is a metaphor for something more mundane, a criminal organization that uses isolation and psychological manipulation to exploit vulnerable travelers. Others suggest it represents collective trauma, a way for local communities to process the horror of the 1988 murder by creating a fictional enemy that embodies their fears. But those who have experienced the village firsthand, if their testimonies can be believed, insist it is entirely real, entirely literal, and entirely evil. They describe a place where human cruelty has been refined over centuries, where the normal rules of reality have been suspended in favor of something older and more terrible. According to the most recent reports, the village has adapted to modern times while maintaining its ancient practices. Residents supposedly monitor police radios to know when search parties are approaching. They've learned to mimic cell phone signals, luring lost hikers toward village territory with fake messages from concerned family members. Most disturbing, they've allegedly begun using social media to identify potential victims. People hiking alone, travelers without detailed itineraries, urban explorers seeking abandoned locations. The village's population reportedly grows by a dozen new residents each year, most of them young people drawn by the tunnel's reputation, or older individuals who disappeared while hiking in the area. The residents treat these newcomers well initially, providing food, shelter, and companionship. But as days pass, the new arrivals discover that leaving requires permissions that become increasingly difficult to obtain, and that breaking village rules results in punishments that grow more severe with each infraction. Whether Inunaki Village exists as a physical location or merely as a persistent delusion shared by those traumatized by their experiences near the tunnel remains an open question. But the legend's power to inspire fear is undeniable, particularly among those who have felt the mountain's malevolent influence firsthand. Local authorities officially deny the village's existence, classifying all related reports as hoaxes, misidentifications, or symptoms of psychological distress. But unofficial conversations with retired police officers reveal a different picture, one of ongoing investigations that lead nowhere, evidence that disappears from storage, and witnesses who recant their testimonies after returning from solo interviews in locations they refuse to identify. The legend of Inunaki Village serves as both warning and invitation. It warns travelers to avoid the mountain's remote areas, to never accept help from strangers encountered on isolated roads, and to turn back immediately if they encounter signs reading about constitutional exemptions. But it also invites the curious, the desperate, and the foolish to test the legend for themselves, to discover whether the village is real or merely another ghost story born from tragedy and superstition. For those brave enough to venture into the forests beyond Old Inunaki Tunnel, the village allegedly waits with infinite patience, its residents always ready to welcome new neighbors who might choose to stay forever. Whether that welcome is genuine hospitality or something far more sinister depends on who you ask, and whether they are still capable of remembering their life before the mountain claimed them. The only certainty is that more people disappear in those forests each year than can be explained by accidents or misadventure alone. And on clear nights, when the wind carries sounds from the mountain depths, local residents still report hearing what sounds like howling dogs echoing from places no dogs should be. In the digital age, urban exploration has become a popular pursuit, with thousands of adventurers documenting their journeys into abandoned places and sharing their discoveries online. For these modern explorers, Old Inunaki Tunnel represents the ultimate challenge, a location that combines historical significance, supernatural reputation, and genuine danger into one irresistible package. Their expeditions, armed with high-tech recording equipment and social media platforms, have generated the most compelling evidence, yet that something genuinely otherworldly haunts that cursed passage. But they've also paid a terrible price for their curiosity. The first documented modern exploration of the tunnel occurred in 2003, when a group of Tokyo University students, calling themselves Ghost Hunters Japan, attempted to spend a full night inside the sealed passage. Their plan was ambitious: multiple cameras, digital thermometers, EMF detectors, and audio recording equipment that could capture sounds beyond human hearing range. They intended to stream their exploration live on an early internet platform, providing real-time documentation of any paranormal phenomena. The stream began normally at 11 p.m., with 4 students introducing themselves and their equipment to a small audience of online viewers. Takeshi, the group leader, was confident and enthusiastic as he explained their plan to spend 8 hours inside the tunnel, documenting any supernatural encounters. His teammates, Yuki, Naoto, and Sakshiko, appeared nervous but excited as they bypassed the barriers and entered the tunnel proper. For the first hour, everything proceeded according to plan. The students methodically documented the tunnel's current condition, pointing out graffiti that seemed to move in their flashlight beams, and describing temperature variations that their instruments couldn't quite capture. Viewers noticed audio distortions that the explorers themselves seemed unaware of, whispers beneath their conversations, footsteps that didn't match their movements, and what sounded like distant screaming that faded whenever they paused to listen. At 12:17 A, according to the timestamp on the surviving footage, something changed. Sachiko was filming the tunnel's curved center section when her camera began picking up figures that were invisible to the naked eye. At first, viewers dismissed these as camera artifacts or tricks of light and shadow. But as the images became clearer, It was impossible to deny that the camera was seeing people where none existed. Dozens of translucent figures walking the tunnel. S-length, some in modern clothing, others in attire from previous decades. The students themselves remained unaware of what their equipment was capturing until viewers began flooding the chat with panicked comments. When they finally turned their attention to the camera displays, their reactions were captured in disturbing detail. Naoto dropped his EMF detector and began hyperventilating. Yuki started crying uncontrollably. Takeshi, the confident leader, could only stare at the screen in paralyzed terror. But it was Sachiko's reaction that provided the most chilling moment in the entire recording. As she watched the parade of ghostly figures on her camera display, her expression gradually changed from fear to recognition to a kind of horrible understanding. She began speaking in a voice that wasn't quite her own, describing events that had happened in the tunnel decades before she was born, recounting conversations she couldn't possibly have witnessed. "The construction worker is here," she said in a monotone that was nothing like her earlier enthusiasm. "The one who fell when the ceiling collapsed in 1951. He is asking why we sealed him in. He wants to know why we left him in the dark." The stream continued for another hour, but the content became increasingly disturbing. The students' equipment registered temperature drops that should have been physically impossible in the confined space. Their audio recorders captured voices speaking in languages that linguistic experts later couldn't identify. Most unsettling, the cameras began showing events that weren't happening in real time, ghostly reenactments of past tragedies, including what appeared to be a detailed recreation of the 1988 murder. At 1:43 a.m., the stream abruptly ended. Not a technical failure or power loss, but a deliberate shutdown performed by someone who understood the broadcasting equipment perfectly. The final frame showed Takeshi reaching toward the camera with an expression of absolute terror, his mouth open in a scream that the audio never captured. Recovery teams found the students 3 days later, all four unconscious near the tunnel entrance. They were severely dehydrated and suffering from exposure, but showed no signs of physical injury. However, their psychological state was deeply concerning. Medical examinations revealed that all four had lost significant memories, not just of their time in the tunnel, but of entire years of their lives. Sachiko, who had demonstrated the most extreme reaction during the stream, had regressed to a childlike mental state and spoke only in whispers for months afterward. The footage they captured became legendary in paranormal investigation circles, despite authorities' attempts to suppress it. Copies circulated on file-sharing networks and eventually found their way to video platforms, where they accumulated millions of views. Experts who analyzed the material found evidence of phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of both technology and reality. Dr. Akira Taniguchi, a physicist at Tokyo University who studied the recordings, noted that the cameras had captured electromagnetic signatures that shouldn't exist in a simple concrete tunnel. The audio recordings contained frequencies that were simultaneously above and below human hearing range, a physical impossibility that suggested the sounds existed partially outside normal dimensional space. More disturbing were the chronological anomalies in the footage. Time codes on the various cameras showed different elapsed times despite being synchronized before the expedition. Some cameras recorded events that others missed entirely, not due to positioning or technical failures, but as if they were documenting different versions of the same reality. One particularly unsettling sequence showed Sachiko having a conversation with someone who wasn't visible on any other camera, responding to questions that weren't audible on any microphone, discussing events that contradicted the group's known itinerary. The 2003 expedition should have served as a definitive warning to other urban explorers, but instead, it only increased interest in the tunnel. The footage provided what many considered proof of genuine paranormal activity, making Old Inunaki Tunnel a pilgrimage destination for ghost hunters and thrill seekers from around the world. Subsequent expeditions have yielded increasingly disturbing results. In 2007, a British paranormal investigation team called Darkness Falls attempted to recreate the 2003 exploration with more sophisticated equipment. They made it less than 2 hours before fleeing the tunnel in panic, leaving behind thousands of dollars worth of recording devices. The equipment was later recovered by police, but the footage it contained was so disturbing that authorities classified it as potential evidence in ongoing investigations and refused to release it to the public. Leaked descriptions from officers who viewed the material speak of recordings that show team members interacting with people who weren't there, having conversations about events that never occurred, and displaying knowledge of tunnel history that they couldn't possibly have researched. Most unsettling, the final recordings allegedly show the team members systematically destroying their own equipment while explaining to unseen listeners that they understand now and won't tell anyone about the village. Solo explorers have fared even worse. In 2009, a YouTuber known as TunnelRat84 attempted to spend 24 hours alone in the tunnel, broadcasting live to prove that the supernatural stories were exaggerated. His stream lasted 6 hours and 43 minutes, during which viewers watched his confident demeanor gradually deteriorate into paranoid terror. The final hour of footage shows him having heated arguments with people who weren't there, defending actions he hadn't taken, and apologizing for crimes he'd never committed. TunnelRat84's real name was never publicly released, but sources close to the investigation revealed that he was found outside the tunnel in a catatonic state, unable to respond to questions or recognize his own reflection. He was institutionalized for treatment of what doctors described as complete psychological reconstruction, as if his original personality had been entirely replaced by someone else's memories and trauma. The pattern of psychological devastation among tunnel explorers has led some researchers to theorize that the location itself has a consciousness, a malevolent intelligence that feeds on human fear and curiosity. Dr. Yuki Harada, who has studied the tunnel's effects on visitors for over a decade, believes that the 1988 murder created a spiritual vortex that draws negative energy from across the region and concentrates it within the concrete walls. Each person who enters with the intention of documenting the supernatural becomes a conduit for whatever exists there, she explained in a sealed report to regional authorities. They're not just observing paranormal phenomena, they're participating in it, becoming part of the tunnel's expanding influence. This theory gains credibility from the experiences of more recent explorers who report phenomena that extend far beyond the tunnel itself. Teams exploring the area have encountered villages that don't appear on maps, roads that lead to destinations that shouldn't exist, and residents who speak about current events from decades in the past. Some expeditions have returned with members who claim to have lived in the area for years, despite having arrived only days before. One particularly disturbing case from 2019 involved a team of 5 investigators who entered the tunnel at dawn and emerged at sunset, claiming to have spent a week inside. According to their account, the tunnel's interior had somehow expanded into a vast underground complex, complete with living quarters, cooking facilities, and residents who welcomed them as long-lost family members. The team's leader, who insisted on being called by a name that wasn't on any identification document, described elaborate meals shared with tunnel residents, conversations about local history that contradicted all recorded facts, and tours of underground chambers that connected to cave systems throughout the mountain. When pressed for details about these experiences, team members became agitated and defensive, insisting that outsiders wouldn't understand the tunnel's true nature. More troubling, the team returned with additional members, 2 individuals who claimed to be local guides, but whose identities couldn't be verified through any database. These supposed guides spoke perfect Japanese, but used grammatical structures from centuries past. They carried no identification, had no digital footprints, and seemed genuinely confused by modern technology. When authorities attempted to question them separately, they vanished from the police station without triggering any security systems or appearing on any surveillance cameras. The psychological evaluations of the original 5 team members revealed a shared delusion, so detailed and consistent that psychiatrists initially suspected they had been drugged or subjected to elaborate hoaxes. But toxicology tests showed no foreign substances in their systems. An investigation of their backgrounds revealed no connections to groups or individuals capable of orchestrating such complex deceptions. Most disturbing, the team members' personalities had subtly but significantly changed. Family members reported that they used different speech patterns, preferred different foods, and displayed knowledge of subjects they'd never studied. One team member, previously fluent only in Japanese and English, began speaking what linguists identified as a regional dialect that had been extinct for over a century. Another developed religious beliefs that incorporated elements from Shinto, Buddhism, and practices that didn't match any known spiritual tradition. These personality changes appear to be permanent. Follow-up interviews conducted months later showed that the affected individuals had no awareness that they were different from before their tunnel experience. They insisted they had always spoken in archaic dialects, always held their current beliefs, and always possessed their newfound knowledge of local history. Brain scans revealed unusual activity patterns in areas associated with memory formation and identity, as if their neural pathways had been fundamentally rewired. The tunnel's influence on modern explorers has evolved beyond simple haunting into something resembling active recruitment. Recent expeditions report encounters with current and former explorers who claim to have established permanent residence in the area. These individuals appear healthy and happy, but demonstrate concerning gaps in their knowledge of current events and an unsettling devotion to what they describe as tunnel culture. Social media platforms have become inadvertent recruitment tools for whatever force controls the tunnel. Urban exploration forums feature increasingly sophisticated posts from users who claim to have found safe passage through the tunnel and discovered the true community that exists beyond it. These posts use subtle psychological techniques to appeal to readers' sense of adventure, curiosity about the unknown, and desire to be part of exclusive experiences. Analysis of these recruitment posts reveals patterns that suggest coordination beyond what individual users could accomplish. They appear simultaneously on multiple platforms, use similar language structures despite allegedly coming from different authors, and contain embedded suggestions that become apparent only when the posts are analyzed collectively. Most concerning, users who interact heavily with these posts often report dreams about the tunnel, sudden urges to visit the area, and a growing sense that their current lives are somehow incomplete. Local authorities have attempted to monitor and control access to the tunnel, but their efforts have been consistently undermined by equipment failures, communication breakdowns, and personnel issues. Security cameras positioned to watch the tunnel entrance routinely malfunction, always during nighttime hours when unauthorized access is most likely. Guards assigned to patrol the area frequently request transfers after reporting encounters that supervisors classify as stress-induced hallucinations, but which follow patterns too consistent to dismiss as individual psychological breaks. One security supervisor, speaking anonymously, described the challenges of protecting a location that seems to actively resist protection. Every technological solution we implement fails within days. Barriers are bypassed without being damaged. Alarms trigger when nothing visible sets them off. Most disturbing, our own personnel become advocates for public access to the tunnel, arguing that we're interfering with something that should be left alone. The tunnel, as supernatural reputation, has attracted not just urban explorers, but also spiritual practitioners who believe they can cleanse or contain its negative influence. Buddhist monks, Shinto priests, and practitioners of various folk traditions have all attempted purification rituals, but their efforts have uniformly backfired. Instead of reducing paranormal activity, These interventions seem to amplify it, as if the tunnel feeds on spiritual energy regardless of the practitioner's intentions. Father Johannes Nakamura, a Catholic priest who attempted an exorcism in 2018, described his experience as encountering a darkness that perverted every prayer, turned every blessing into a curse, and made me question fundamental assumptions about the nature of good and evil. He emerged from the tunnel after only 20 minutes, but reported that subjectively, he had experienced hours of spiritual warfare against entities that seemed to understand Christian theology better than he did. The priest's account describes voices that quoted scripture in ways that inverted its meaning, supernatural phenomena that mimicked religious miracles for blasphemous purposes, and a presence that claimed to be not demonic, but something far older and more fundamental to human experience. It wasn't evil in the Christian sense, he explained in his sealed report to church authorities. It was something that existed before the concepts of good and evil were defined, something that found our moral frameworks amusing rather than threatening. Modern paranormal investigators have theorized that Old Inunaki Tunnel has become what they term a reality anchor, a location where supernatural activity has become so concentrated that it begins to warp the nature of reality itself within its sphere of influence. This would explain why explorers report experiences that contradict physical laws, why electronic equipment functions differently within the tunnel area, and why people's personalities change after extended exposure to the location. The reality anchor theory suggests that the tunnel has become a doorway between dimensions, allowing entities, influences, and even geographic locations from alternate realities to bleed through into our world. This would account for reports of encountering village structures that exist in some versions of reality, but not others, meeting people who remember different versions of historical events, and experiencing time distortions that affect some explorers but not others. If this theory is correct, then every person who enters the tunnel with strong intentions, whether to document paranormal activity, prove supernatural claims false, or conduct spiritual cleansing, inadvertently strengthens its reality warping properties. Each expedition provides the tunnel with new energy, new perspectives, and new possibilities for expansion into consensus reality. The most recent development in the tunnel, evolution, is the emergence of what investigators call proxy hauntings, supernatural phenomena occurring in the homes and workplaces of people who have never visited the location but have viewed extensive footage or documentation of it. These secondary victims report ghostly encounters that mirror classic tunnel experiences, whispers in unknown languages, temperature fluctuations that follow no pattern, and encounters with figures who claim to be current or former tunnel residents. These proxy hauntings suggest that the tunnel's influence can spread through digital media, making it potentially impossible to contain through physical barriers alone. Each view of tunnel footage, each reading of exploration accounts, each discussion of the location as history potentially creates new vectors for supernatural influence to spread throughout the population. As we conclude this investigation into Old Inunaki Tunnel, several theories emerge to explain its malevolent influence. The criminal catalyst theory. The 1988 murder was so brutal and occurred in a location already steeped in negative energy that it created a permanent spiritual wound, allowing dark entities to establish permanent residence in our reality. The dimensional gateway theory. The tunnel serves as a naturally occurring portal between parallel realities, and human attention and intention have gradually widened this gateway until it allows substantial bleed through between dimensions. The collective unconscious theory. The tunnel has become a focal point for humanity's collective fears about isolation, violence, and death, manifesting these psychological constructs as seemingly objective supernatural phenomena. The ancient evil theory. Something genuinely malevolent was disturbed during the tunnel's construction and has been growing stronger with each decade, feeding on human fear, pain, and curiosity to increase its power and influence. The living location theory. The tunnel itself has achieved a form of consciousness through decades of human attention and supernatural activity, becoming a predatory entity that lures victims to sustain and expand its existence. Whatever the true explanation, Old Inunaki Tunnel remains one of the most compelling and dangerous paranormal locations in the world. Its influence continues to spread through digital media, personal testimonies, and the growing community of individuals who claim to have found a new home in its shadowed depths. Local authorities officially maintain that the tunnel is simply an abandoned piece of infrastructure that has attracted urban legends due to its association with a historical crime. They encourage people to avoid the area for safety reasons related to structural instability and difficult terrain. But unofficial conversations with retired investigators reveal a different perspective, one of ongoing concern about a phenomenon that defies conventional explanation and seems to grow more powerful with each passing year. For those drawn to explore Old Inunaki Tunnel, despite its terrifying reputation, the evidence suggests that curiosity alone may not be worth the potential cost. Every documented expedition has resulted in either psychological trauma, permanent personality changes, or complete disappearance. The tunnel seems to offer visitors exactly what they're seeking: proof of the supernatural adventure beyond, ordinary experience, or spiritual encounters with forces beyond human understanding. But these gifts come with prices that become apparent only after they've been paid. The final lesson of Old Inunaki Tunnel may be that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some doors are meant to stay closed, and some hungers should never be fed. In our age of global connectivity and digital documentation, the tunnel's influence spreads further than ever before, reaching anyone curious enough to seek out its secrets. Perhaps the wisest approach is to treat Old Inunaki Tunnel as our ancestors treated certain locations, as places that demand respect, distance, and acknowledgement that human understanding has limits that shouldn't be crossed. The tunnel waits in the mountain darkness, patient as stone, ready to welcome anyone brave enough or foolish enough to test the boundaries between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And some places, once they know your name, will never stop calling you home.